The sky above Elgin, Illinois, hung heavy with low gray clouds, pressing down on the empty back roads like a warning. The wind carried a chill not from the weather, but from something darker in the air. Lying still on the cracked pavement, a large German shepherd named Kale waited. Kale's eyes remained locked on the distant roar of approaching motorcycles, his body battered but his spirit unbroken. Ephraim, miles away, felt a sudden, inexplicable jolt in his chest. It was as if Kale's silent plea for help had traveled across time and distance, stirring something deep within him. Before diving into this intense story, leave a comment sharing where you're watching from, and don't forget to hit the like button to show your support. Every like counts. Ephraim Dalla was a man of contradictions. Once a decorated military cop, a fierce protector with a strong sense of duty, he now lived in self-imposed isolation, hiding from a past that haunted him at every turn. His career was shattered, not by the enemies he had fought, but by his own mistakes. A mission gone wrong, a tragic mistake that cost an innocent life, led to his disgrace and fall from grace. The scandal left him ostracized, and despite his years of service, his name became synonymous with failure and dishonor. After the scandal, Ephraim disappeared from the world. He withdrew into the dense woods of Elgin, Illinois, far away from the reminders of a life he could no longer face. In the quiet of his small cabin, he tried to forget the man he once was, the man who wore his badge with pride, who swore an oath to serve and protect. He spent his days chopping wood, fixing fences, and tending to the few animals that kept him company. It was a solitary existence, one that allowed him to bury the truth of his past deep within himself. But no matter how far he ran, the past was never far behind. Every time he looked in the mirror, he saw the remnants of the man he used to be, the one who had failed his mission, failed his partner, and failed himself. The pain was a constant companion, a reminder that no matter how hard he tried, he could never escape the consequences of his actions. And yet, through all the years of silence and solitude, there was one thing that never wavered: his bond with Kale. Kale was not just a dog. He was Ephraim's brother in arms, his most loyal companion in both the field and in the quiet moments of their secluded life. A large German shepherd, Kale had been trained to be both a weapon and a friend, the perfect balance of strength and sensitivity. Together, they had faced dangers in the line of duty, their bond forged through years of shared experiences, each one deeper than the last. Kale had seen Ephraim at his best and at his lowest, and through it all, his loyalty never wavered. Their partnership began when Ephraim was assigned to the K9 unit. Kale, just a pup at the time, was raw, untamed, and full of potential. Ephraim had been skeptical at first, unsure of the bond they could form. But as the years passed, the two grew inseparable. Kale's sharp instincts and unwavering courage had saved Ephraim more times than he could count. In return, Ephraim had protected Kale, made sure his partner was always cared for, even when the mission seemed impossible. When Ephraim's career had ended in disgrace, it was Kale who remained by his side, unwavering in his devotion. Despite the years of isolation and the physical scars from the violence of their past, Kale's spirit never dulled. He was no longer on active duty, but in Ephraim's eyes, he was still the hero, the one constant in a world that had turned its back on them both. Now, as Kale lay injured on the pavement, it was clear that this bond had become something more than man and dog. It was a silent promise, one that had been made long before and would continue, even through the darkest of times. The roar of motorcycle engines echoed through the otherwise quiet streets of Elgin, Illinois. A storm was on the horizon, its thunderous approach making the air thick with tension. The bikers, clad in black leather vests adorned with grim patches and skulls, surrounded the aging K9, Kale, as he lay vulnerable on the cracked pavement. The leader of the pack, Osri, stepped forward, his cold eyes narrowing as he locked onto the large German shepherd. There was a flicker of recognition in his gaze, a history that Kale and Ephraim shared, a history Osri had no intention of letting go. "This ain't no stray," muttered Barton, one of the younger members of the gang, as he eyed the dog with disdain. Osri, his jaw clenched in silent fury, corrected him. "No, this is his dog, Ephraim Dalla's dog." Ephraim's name hung in the air like a heavy fog, each syllable pulling at a memory long buried. Osri knew the significance of Kale, the bond between the dog and the man who had once served with honor. But now, that honor was tarnished, and the dog had become nothing more than a symbol of a past Osri wanted to erase. Without warning, Barton stepped forward and kicked Kale hard in the ribs. The dog yelped in pain, but there was no cowering, no fear in his eyes. Only a defiant, unwavering gaze that seemed to say, "I will not run." One by one, other bikers followed suit, delivering brutal blows that caused blood to pool beneath Kale's body. Yet, he never moved, never retreated. As the bikers continued their assault, Osri stood still, watching. He knew this was personal. Ephraim would feel this pain. He would come for him. The question was when. And when he did, Osri would be ready. Miles away, Ephraim was chopping wood in the quiet solitude of his cabin when an overwhelming sensation suddenly gripped him. A deep, unshakable feeling that something was terribly wrong. His axe paused mid-swing, a sharp pain seizing his chest, as though his heart had skipped a beat. His breath caught, and in that instant, he knew. Kale. Ephraim dropped the axe, his hands trembling slightly as his thoughts spiraled in confusion and fear. The old leather leash that had once been a part of their training hung by the door, still engraved with the words, Kale Phantom Unit. He had never removed it, even after all these years. It was a connection he couldn't explain, not even to himself. But he had learned to trust it. Their bond went beyond the simple link of handler and dog. It was something more primal, more in tune with the world around them. Ephraim grabbed the leash and stepped outside, his eyes narrowing against the growing storm that was starting to echo the unease within him. Something is wrong. His heart pounded as he stared at the horizon, the familiar ache in his chest intensifying. Ephraim had spent years burying his past, trying to move on, but this bond, the connection with Kale, had never faded. It pulled at him now, urging him to act. Without hesitation, he climbed into his truck, the keys already in his hand. The roar of the engine was drowned out by the rush of blood in his ears as he drove into the storm. Kale was in danger, and Ephraim was coming for him. He didn't know who had done this or why, but he knew one thing for sure. He was done hiding. The reckoning had begun. If you enjoyed this story, subscribe to our channel for more gripping tales like this. Your support helps us continue bringing powerful stories to life. Ephraim drove through the back roads of Elgin, his eyes focused on the horizon as the storm clouds gathered above him, heavy and foreboding. His knuckles were white on the steering wheel, and his breath came in shallow, tense bursts. The world he had left behind, the life of a soldier, a protector, a man of honor, felt so distant now, like a faded photograph he'd long since buried. He had spent years building a quiet life, away from the pain of his past, away from the betrayal and scandal that had ruined him. But now, the storm was calling him back. He hadn't planned on returning, not really. He had believed the past would stay behind, a closed chapter in his life. But this was different. This wasn't about the mission that had gone wrong or the scandal that had destroyed his career. This was about Kale. Ephraim glanced down at the old leather leash in his hand, a symbol of the bond that had always kept him grounded. Kale, his partner, his brother in arms, was out there, suffering. And Ephraim knew that he could never turn his back on him. Not now. The further he drove, the more his resolve hardened. The old Ephraim, the one who had stood tall, ready to fight, ready to protect, began to resurface. He could feel it in his chest, a familiar fire rekindling, burning away the years of doubt and regret. The past might have broken him, but it didn't define him. He would face it again. As Ephraim pulled into the outskirts of town, memories of his former life came flooding back. The familiar landmarks, the places where he had trained with Kale, the quiet mornings spent patrolling the streets, it all felt like a lifetime ago. The town hadn't changed much, but Ephraim felt like a stranger here, disconnected from the man he used to be. He parked his truck and took a deep breath. It was time to face the ghosts of his past. Time to find out who had hurt Kale, and why. More importantly, it was time to remind them all who Ephraim Dalla really was. The storm wasn't just in the sky. It was inside him, too. And it was only just beginning. As Ephraim moved deeper into the town, memories of his past began to resurface, both painful and vivid. But it was Osri's name that hit him the hardest. He had hoped he would never have to face the man again, the one person who knew the truth behind his downfall, the one man who had shared in the mistakes, the guilt, and the betrayal. Osri wasn't just a former comrade. He was the man who had witnessed Ephraim's worst moment, when everything had crumbled. Years ago, Osri had been Ephraim's closest ally. They had worked side by side in the K9 unit, built a camaraderie forged in the heat of battle. Osri had been Ephraim's mentor of sorts, guiding him through the intricacies of military operations, teaching him how to read the battlefield, how to lead. Ephraim had respected him, looked up to him. But then came the scandal. The mission that went wrong, the innocent life lost, and the blame that had been placed on Ephraim's shoulders. Osri, in a moment of fear and self-preservation, had chosen to protect himself. He let Ephraim take the fall, knowing that the truth would ruin them both. The fallout was brutal. Ephraim was dishonorably discharged, his career destroyed, his reputation shattered. Osri, meanwhile, walked away unscathed, moving into the shadows of the biker world. His loyalty shifted, now pledged to a new family of criminals who were more than willing to take advantage of his expertise and past connections. But Ephraim knew something Osri had never shared. Osri had been the one to push him aside, to let him bear the weight of the consequences while he continued to climb, unburdened. The guilt had never left Ephraim, and neither had the bitterness toward the man who had abandoned him when he needed him most. Now, Osri was leading a group of ruthless bikers, a far cry from the man Ephraim once admired. He had become everything Ephraim despised, someone willing to sacrifice others for his own gain. And it was this man, this former ally, who had hurt Kale. Ephraim's jaw tightened as he drove further into town. He wasn't just going to confront Osri for the attack on his dog. He was going to face him for the betrayal that had shattered his life. And this time, things would be different. Ephraim parked his truck at the edge of town, the familiar yet unfamiliar place now looming in front of him. The storm had grown closer, and the air had thickened with tension. He could feel it in his bones, the weight of his past pressing against him as he stood on the threshold of confronting everything he had tried so hard to bury. For years, Ephraim had told himself that he had been a victim of circumstance, that the mission had gone wrong through no fault of his own. He had believed the lie that Osri had left him to die, that Osri had betrayed him when it mattered most. But now, as he stood in the midst of the town that once knew him as a hero, the truth began to unravel in his mind. Ephraim had never fully faced what had happened that day. The mission had been disastrous, but it wasn't just bad luck that led to failure. Ephraim had made a crucial mistake, a decision that no one else had forced upon him. It wasn't Osri's fault. It wasn't the circumstances. It was his own fear, his hesitation to act when action was required. The moment that changed everything came in the heat of battle, when Ephraim hesitated just long enough for everything to go sideways. An innocent civilian had died as a result of his failure to act swiftly. Ephraim had been responsible, and that truth was something he had avoided confronting ever since. In his mind, he had blamed Osri. He had convinced himself that Osri, in an attempt to protect his own reputation, had left him to take the fall for a mistake he had made. But deep down, Ephraim knew the truth. The responsibility was his alone. As Ephraim walked toward the edge of town, the memories flooded back, vivid flashes of the day that had destroyed everything he had worked for. He could see the faces of the innocent civilians caught in the crossfire, the panic that had set in when the situation began to spiral out of control. And then there was the moment when he froze, when he couldn't bring himself to make the call, to act decisively. The hesitation that cost a life. Osri had stood beside him, as always. But that day, he had made a choice. He had stayed silent, knowing that to speak the truth would ruin everything. Instead, Osri had chosen to protect himself. He had covered up the failure, letting Ephraim take the blame. In the eyes of the world, Ephraim was the one who had failed. He was the one who had made the fatal mistake. But Osri had known better. He had known that Ephraim was the one who had faltered, and not for the reasons Ephraim had convinced himself of. It was this truth, this buried guilt, that Ephraim had never truly faced. He had spent years running from it, hiding from the man he had become. But now, as he stood on the edge of his past, ready to confront Osri, the weight of that guilt pressed down on him, heavier than ever. Ephraim wasn't just fighting for justice for Cale. He was fighting for his own redemption. He wasn't the hero he once believed himself to be. He had failed, and it had cost him everything. But he still had the chance to make things right, to face the consequences of his actions, and to finally confront the man who had once been his closest ally, the man who had helped him bury the truth. As the storm raged above him, Ephraim understood that he would have to face the full brunt of his past, to accept responsibility for the decisions he had made, no matter how painful. This was his reckoning. And it was time to take the first step toward finding the peace he had been searching for all these years. Ephraim took a deep breath, feeling the weight of his past settle heavily on his shoulders as he approached the familiar outskirts of the town. The storm had become a relentless downpour, but it didn't matter. Nothing had mattered for so long. What mattered now was Cale, his partner, his friend, and the chance to redeem himself. Years of hiding had dulled the sharpness of his instincts, but deep down, Ephraim knew the truth. He was never meant to be a man running away from his past. His purpose, now clearer than ever, was to face it, head-on, without excuses or justifications. No more pretending that the mistakes, the blood, and the guilt had no consequence. As he continued down the road, the memories of his time in the K-9 unit with Cale began to surface. Those were the days when he felt like he had everything under control, like there was still honor to be salvaged in the world. But those days felt so distant now, as if they belonged to someone else. Someone who had hoped that running away from his past would allow him to build a new future. It hadn't worked. Ephraim could still remember the first time he had met Cale. The young, scrappy German shepherd had been full of raw energy, untrained, but with a potential Ephraim had quickly recognized. They had both been thrown into tough situations, and together, they had learned the hard lessons of life. They had trained together, fought together, bled together. The bond between them was forged in the fires of danger, built on the silent understanding that they were the only ones who could truly rely on each other. But after the mission that had destroyed everything, it was Cale who had stayed by Ephraim's side. Even after the disgrace, after the years of silence, Cale had been there. They had become something more than just a handler and his dog. They had become survivors. And in Cale's quiet companionship, Ephraim had found the strength to keep going. But now, it was time to do something more than survive. It was time to make amends. Ephraim wasn't looking for revenge, he realized. Revenge would not give him the peace he sought. He didn't want to destroy Osri or the men who had wronged him. What he needed was redemption, and that came not through destruction, but through confronting the past, owning his mistakes, and finally making things right. He pulled over by a run-down motel on the outskirts of the town, a place where he knew the bikers frequented, including Osri and his crew. He had prepared for this moment, mentally and physically. The gun and knife he kept hidden under the seat were not for vengeance. They were a means of protection, a reminder that he wouldn't let anyone hurt Kale again. But the real weapons were his resolve, his desire for closure, and the truth. He stepped out of the truck and stood under the pouring rain, the world around him damp and dark, but his mind clear. There was no turning back. His confrontation with Osri was inevitable, but this time, it would be different. Ephraim would not hide anymore. He was no longer the man who ran away from his failures. He was the man who would face them, no matter the cost. The pain of his past no longer threatened to consume him. Instead, it gave him the clarity he had been missing. This wasn't about revenge. It was about facing his demons, accepting the mistakes he had made, and standing strong despite the weight of it all. As Ephraim walked toward the motel, his mind sharpened with purpose. The storm raged on, but it didn't matter. He knew that this was the moment when everything would change. He was ready to face Osri, ready to expose the truth, and ready to make amends, for himself, for Kale, and for the man he used to be. This character truly deserves a like, but sadly, they haven't received it yet. Let's show them the appreciation they deserve. The rain pelted Ephraim as he stood in the shadow of the motel, watching the flickering neon sign that buzzed in the storm. His heart beat with a heavy rhythm, not of fear but of anticipation, his pulse steady, his mind sharp. The storm had turned the small town into a ghostly landscape, quiet except for the thunder that cracked across the sky like the sound of distant cannons. The atmosphere felt charged, as if the world itself held its breath. Inside the motel, Ephraim knew Osri and his crew were gathered, preparing for whatever sinister business they had come to conduct. The bikers weren't just men of the road. They were more than a gang. They were a fractured family, each one carrying scars and secrets, bound together by betrayal, violence, and survival. Ephraim had been a part of that world once, a man who had walked side by side with Osri in another life. But that life, the one where they fought together, respected each other, was long gone. The bond they had shared had fractured the day Ephraim made the mistake that cost an innocent life. It was then that Osri had chosen his survival over his loyalty to Ephraim. He had abandoned him, and in doing so, he had destroyed their friendship. Now, standing at the edge of this motel parking lot, Ephraim felt the weight of those years come crashing down on him. This was the moment he had been avoiding for so long. The confrontation. The reckoning. And it wasn't just about him. It was about Kale, his dog, his partner, his family. The door of the motel swung open, and Ephraim saw Osri step outside, his tall figure barely visible in the dim light. His eyes were hidden behind dark sunglasses, even though the rain fell in sheets, drenching everything around him. The man was a relic of the past, calm, controlled, and always a step ahead. But Ephraim knew the truth now. He knew that this man, this former ally, was no longer the person he had once respected. Osri took a drag from his cigarette, his eyes scanning the empty parking lot as if waiting for something, or someone. Ephraim stepped forward, his boots crunching on the gravel. Osri's head snapped to attention at the sound, his eyes narrowing as they locked on Ephraim's. "Well, well," Osri said, his voice cold and distant. "The ghost of Ephraim Dalla finally decides to show himself. I was wondering when you'd come crawling out of hiding." Ephraim didn't flinch, didn't respond with anger. He stood there, watching Osri through the pouring rain, his face unreadable. The years had hardened him, but there was a deep sorrow in his eyes, the kind that came from confronting the ghosts of the past. "I'm not here for small talk, Osri," Ephraim replied, his voice low but steady. "I'm here for Kale." At the mention of Kale's name, Osri's expression shifted, a flicker of recognition in his eyes. But it was only a momentary crack in his otherwise unshakable facade. He dropped his cigarette to the ground, grinding it under his heel. "Your dog," Osri scoffed. "You've got some nerve coming here, Dala. You think that piece of mutt means anything? This is bigger than your damn dog. This is about power, survival." Ephraim's jaw clenched. "You think you've got power?" he asked, taking a slow step forward. "You abandoned me, Osri. You threw me to the wolves, and now you think you can walk away from all of this?" Osri smirked, a bitter edge to his smile. "You're weak, Ephraim. You always were. You couldn't even protect your own team. So don't talk to me about power." Ephraim's fists tightened at his sides, but he refused to let the anger control him. This wasn't about anger. It was about facing the truth. "I don't need to hear you lecture me about weakness," Ephraim said quietly. "I came here to make sure you know that I'm not running anymore. I'm not hiding from my mistakes. But I'm going to make you face what you did to me." Osri took a step forward, his eyes narrowing as he studied Ephraim's face. For the first time, there was a flicker of doubt in his expression. Ephraim could see it now. Osri was starting to realize that his old comrade wasn't the broken man he had once been. Ephraim had risen from the ashes of his past, and in doing so, he had become something stronger. Something Osri hadn't accounted for. "What do you want, Ephraim?" Osri asked, his voice colder now, guarded. "You want revenge? You think you can just come back and make things right?" Ephraim's eyes never left Osri's. "I don't want revenge," he said, his voice steady. "I want you to face the truth. You didn't just betray me, Osri. You betrayed everything we stood for." There was a long pause, the rain beating down harder around them. Osri opened his mouth to respond, but Ephraim didn't give him the chance. "I came here to remind you who you were," Ephraim continued, his voice cutting through the storm. "You were my brother in arms, and I loved you like a brother. But you forgot that when it mattered. And now, everything you've built, everything you've become, it's all built on lies." For a moment, Osri stood there, his face unreadable. Then, without warning, he reached for the gun at his side, his fingers brushing the grip. Ephraim's hand went instinctively to his own weapon, but he didn't draw it. Instead, he took another step forward, his gaze unyielding. "I don't want to fight you, Osri," Ephraim said. "But I will if I have to." Osri hesitated, his fingers still resting on the gun's grip. He looked into Ephraim's eyes, and for the first time in a long while, a flicker of uncertainty crossed his face. The man who had always been in control, who had led with an iron fist, was now facing something he didn't know how to handle, the truth. Ephraim wasn't there to kill him. He wasn't there to destroy him. He was there to force Osri to confront the life he had built on betrayal, to show him that no matter how far he ran, the truth would always catch up. The tension hung in the air like a storm waiting to break. Neither man moved. Neither spoke. Then, with a final glance, Osri slowly lowered his hand from his weapon. The storm raged on, but the moment had passed. Ephraim had won, not with violence, but with the power of truth. The silence between Ephraim and Osri stretched, thick with unspoken words. The rain continued to hammer the ground, but neither man moved. It was as though time had frozen, both locked in a standoff where the real battle wasn't physical. It was moral. Ephraim wasn't here to destroy Osri. He was here to show him who he had become. For a brief moment, Ephraim felt the weight of his own choices, the guilt, the regret, and the years of running from himself. But this moment wasn't about him. It wasn't about how Osri had abandoned him. It was about justice, about righting the wrongs that had lingered for too long. Ephraim stepped forward, his heart steady, knowing that the time for confrontation had come. He wasn't going to back down. This was the reckoning, the one thing he owed to himself, to Kale, and to the truth. Osri's eyes flicked over to the old leather leash still in Ephraim's hand. His mouth twisted into a sneer, and for the first time, Ephraim saw something in Osri's gaze that wasn't just anger. It was fear. Fear of facing the man he had once called a friend. Fear of confronting the past they both shared, a past Osri had been running from just as much as Ephraim. Osri took a deep breath, his fingers still resting on the grip of his gun. "You think you can walk in here, all high and mighty, and act like you're the judge of me?" His voice was harsh, filled with bitterness, but underneath it, there was a tremor, a hint of doubt. "You were nothing before, and you're still nothing now." Ephraim didn't flinch. "You're wrong, Osri," he said, his voice cutting through the rain. "I'm not here to judge you. I'm here to show you the man you've become." With that, Ephraim moved forward again, keeping his distance but closing the gap between them. His voice was calm, but every word carried the weight of years of unspoken truth. "You turned your back on me when I needed you most. You used me, betrayed me, and when everything fell apart, you stayed standing while I was left in the dirt. But you know what, Osri? You're still standing in the dirt. You just don't know it yet." Osri's jaw clenched. His hand tightened around the gun's grip. "You really think you've got it all figured out, don't you? You think you're some damn hero, showing up here to make me feel bad about myself?" He sneered. "I'm done with that life, Ephraim. I moved on. I've got power now. I've got everything I need." Power. Ephraim's voice rose, the fire of his past igniting once again. "You think this is power?" He motioned around them, the empty parking lot, the empty promises Osri had made to his gang, the fragile empire built on fear. "What you've built is just a house of cards. And I'm not here to knock it down. I'm here to make sure you see it for what it really is. Empty." Osri's eyes darkened. He took a step toward Ephraim, his lips curling into a twisted grin. "You think you're the one who's going to change all this? You think you can just walk back into my life and tell me I'm wrong? It doesn't work like that, Ephraim." Ephraim took a deep breath, steadying himself. He knew Osri was trying to provoke him, to push him into making a rash move. But this wasn't about fighting with fists or guns. This was about confronting the truth. "I'm not going to fight you, Osri," Ephraim said quietly, his voice almost a whisper in the wind. "Because I know something you don't. The people you've surrounded yourself with, they'll be the ones to turn on you, just like you turned on me. You think they follow you because they respect you? They follow you because they're scared of you. And fear only lasts so long before it crumbles." Osri's smirk faltered, just for a moment. His hand slowly relaxed, the grip on his gun loosening, though he didn't drop it. Ephraim took another step forward. "I'm not here to prove I'm better than you, Osri. I'm not here to destroy you. But I am here to make you face what you've done. To make you see that all the power you think you have, it means nothing if you've sold your soul to get it." For a long moment, neither man moved. The rain continued to pour, and the storm raged on, but there was a stillness in the air, a tension that felt as if it might snap at any second. Then, Osri did something Ephraim didn't expect. Slowly, almost hesitantly, he lowered the gun. His shoulders slumped, and for the first time, Ephraim saw something that hadn't been there before: vulnerability. "You're right," Osri muttered, his voice barely audible. "I've spent so long running from what I did. I never realized what it was costing me. What it had cost all of us." Ephraim's heart tightened. He hadn't expected this, hadn't expected Osri to admit the truth so openly. But in that moment he understood. The real fight was never about proving who was right. It was about making the other person see themselves for what they truly were. You can't fix the past, Osri, Ephraim said quietly. But you can stop making the same mistakes. You can stop being afraid of what you did, and maybe, just maybe, you can start doing something right for once. The rain fell heavier, but Ephraim didn't feel it anymore. In the midst of the storm, he had found his peace, not in revenge, but in truth. Osri stood silently for a moment, the weight of Ephraim's words pressing down on him. Finally, he looked up, his face weary, his eyes filled with regret. I don't know if I can ever make it right, Osri said, his voice raw. You don't have to, Ephraim replied. But you do have to face it. The silence between them was broken only by the storm. Both men stood in it, facing the truth, for the first time in a long while. The reckoning wasn't over, but for now, they both knew the path forward was no longer one of vengeance. It was one of redemption, for both of them. The rain had slowed to a drizzle, but the air was thick with tension. Ephraim stood there, his chest rising and falling with slow, controlled breaths, watching Osri, who remained silent, his eyes fixed on the ground. For a fleeting moment, it seemed as though the world had paused. The storm, the confrontation, the years of pain, all had brought them to this point. But the silence didn't last long. A muffled shout came from behind them, cutting through the stillness like a blade. Ephraim whipped around, instinctively reaching for his gun. From the shadowed corner of the motel, a figure emerged, one of Osri's men, a former ally of Ephraim's, now an enemy. It was Marin, a man Ephraim had once trusted. He was the muscle of Osri's gang, a brute force who used his strength to intimidate anyone who stood in his way. Marin was barreling toward them, his eyes wild, and the cold gleam of a knife in his hand. Ephraim's heart sank. He hadn't expected this. Marin had always been the loose cannon, the one who never knew when to stop. Ephraim knew this wasn't just a threat to him. This was a dangerous man, capable of doing anything to maintain control. Osri didn't react immediately. His back was to Marin, his eyes still locked on Ephraim, as though the conflict they had just begun was all that mattered. But Ephraim didn't have the luxury of focusing solely on Osri's regret. His instincts screamed at him. Marin was going to kill him. In a split second, Ephraim moved. He dove to the side just as Marin lunged, the knife flashing in the dim light. The blade scraped Ephraim's jacket, but the force of the lunge sent him tumbling into the mud. His gun slid out of his reach, and for a moment, he felt completely exposed. Marin stood over him, grinning like a man who had finally caught his prey. You think you can just walk away, Ephraim? You think your little speech changed anything? Marin spat, his breath ragged with anger. Ephraim's body was screaming at him to get up, to fight back, but he knew he couldn't waste energy on this. He had to end it quickly, and the only way to do that was to disarm Marin before he got the chance to make another move. With a swift, practiced motion, Ephraim kicked up into Marin's knee, sending the larger man stumbling backward. The knife went flying from his hand, landing a few feet away. Ephraim didn't waste a second. He lunged forward, grabbing Marin's arm and twisting it behind his back, forcing him to the ground. The fight had only lasted a few moments, but the raw emotion fueling it made every second feel like an eternity. Marin grunted in pain, his face contorted with rage. You think this is over? You think you've won? Ephraim stood above him, breathing heavily, his eyes sharp. The truth was, Ephraim hadn't won yet. There was still too much left unsaid, too much to confront. But in this moment, he felt the weight of the years of his own self-doubt, the heavy burden of failure and betrayal, begin to lift. This wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about making sure that the choices he made now were better than the ones he had made before. "I'm not here to fight you, Meren," Ephraim said, his voice steady but filled with resolve. "I'm here to stop this. To make sure you all understand that what you've done, it doesn't just go away." For a long moment, Meren lay there, the realization that he had lost dawning on him slowly. The fury faded from his face, replaced by a look of confusion, even fear. For the first time, Meren wasn't sure what to do. He wasn't in control anymore. But the silence was short-lived. Ephraim heard the sound of footsteps from behind him, the unmistakable click of a gun being cocked. He turned just in time to see Osri standing there, his hand raised, holding a pistol. The rain splattered against the barrel, but the danger was clear. "I didn't want this, Ephraim," Osri said, his voice raw. "But you pushed me. You pushed all of us." Ephraim stood tall, despite the uncertainty gnawing at him. It was coming to a head, all of it, the guilt, the anger, the unresolved feelings. But he wasn't going to back down now. Not for Osri, not for Meren. He wasn't going to be that man anymore. "What's left, Osri?" Ephraim asked. His voice was calm, steady, despite the pounding of his heart. "What's left after you've torn everything apart? After everything you've done to hold on to this twisted version of power?" Osri's eyes flashed with something, regret or maybe recognition, but it was too late. He had already made his choices. Ephraim had made his too. "I don't want to kill you, Osri," Ephraim said quietly. "I don't want to destroy you. I want you to see what you've done. And then, maybe you can stop." For a long moment, the two men stood there, locked in a battle of wills. Osri's hand trembled slightly as he held the gun, but he didn't fire. The tension was palpable, and Ephraim realized something profound. This was the moment of reckoning. Not just for him, but for Osri too. They were both standing at the edge, both broken in different ways. Then, as if to prove that the past wasn't finished with them, Meren stirred, his breath shallow and labored. But it wasn't just his body that was broken, it was his spirit. The fight, the loyalty, the strength he had once carried with him had crumbled in the face of truth. Ephraim stepped back from the two of them, taking a moment to breathe. In this battle, there were no winners. Not really. But there was hope. For the first time, Ephraim felt like he could breathe. There would be no more hiding. The reckoning had come, and with it, the chance to heal. The world seemed to slow around Ephraim as he stood over Meren, the gun still aimed at him, his breath shallow and his muscles tense. The realization that things had come to this confrontation, this violence, this brokenness, felt surreal, like a dream that wouldn't end. Osri remained silent, his weapon trained on Ephraim, his eyes narrowing as he observed the standoff. The tension between them had thickened, the weight of their history pressing down on their shoulders like a stone. Ephraim could feel the weight of his own choices hanging heavily in the air, but there was something else now, something that made it hard to breathe. A decision had to be made. Meren groaned beneath him, the blood slowly pooling beneath his body. Ephraim had been forced to make a quick move to protect himself, but now, as he looked down at Meren, a sinking feeling twisted in his gut. Was this how it would end? With blood on his hands, with more violence than he had ever wanted? He glanced up at Osri, who was still holding the gun, his expression unreadable. In that moment, Ephraim saw something in Osri's eyes that hadn't been there before. Doubt. The once cold, ruthless man who had shown no hesitation in the past now seemed uncertain. Maybe it was the memory of their time together, the brotherhood they had once shared, or maybe it was something deeper, the realization that the choices they had made led them to this moment of destruction. "You've gone too far, Osri," Ephraim said quietly, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "This isn't just about me anymore. It's about the lives you've destroyed, the people you've hurt. And now, you've pushed me to a point where I have to choose, again. Osri's grip tightened on the gun, his eyes darting between Ephraim and Merrin. You think you have a choice here, Ephraim? He spat. You think you're in control? You're as much a part of this as I am. You've spent your whole life running from the past, and now you're going to make the same mistakes all over again. Ephraim's eyes narrowed, and his chest tightened with a mixture of frustration and sorrow. Was this who Osri had become? Someone who couldn't even see the devastation he had caused? Someone who still believed that power came from fear and control? He looked back down at Merrin. The man was gasping for breath, his face pale, his eyes wide with panic. For a moment, Ephraim saw the young man Merrin had once been, the ally, the comrade, the friend. But now all that was left was a broken shell. He had followed Osri's path, and now it had led him to this. There was nothing left for Merrin, no redemption, no chance to undo the damage. And Ephraim realized, with a sickening clarity, that he had to make a choice. His mind raced. What did he owe to Merrin, to Osri, to himself? Ephraim knew that he couldn't let Merrin's life slip away without consequence. The old soldier in him knew that sometimes, sacrifice was a part of survival. But he wasn't just surviving anymore. He was trying to do better. For Kale, for the people who had trusted him, for himself. I can't save you, Merrin, Ephraim said softly, his voice tinged with sadness. You chose this path. I didn't. You made your choices long before this moment, and now I can't undo them. But you can. You still have the chance to stop this madness, to walk away. Merrin didn't respond. His breathing became more labored, his body trembling as the reality of his situation set in. He was at Ephraim's mercy, but Ephraim didn't want mercy to be the answer. He couldn't afford to let mercy be his excuse for letting someone else get away with their mistakes. Ephraim turned back to Osri, locking eyes with him, the finality of this moment settling over him. This was it. Take the gun down, Osri, Ephraim said, his voice cold with resolve. You and I both know where this ends. If you want to save yourself, if you want to stop this, you have to walk away now. I'm done letting you control me. For a moment, Osri's eyes flickered with something. Regret, fear, anger, maybe all of it. But then, he lowered the gun. It wasn't surrender. It wasn't forgiveness. It was recognition. Osri had been defeated, but not by Ephraim's gun or fists. He had been defeated by the truth, by the weight of his own actions. I'm not the man I used to be, Ephraim, Osri muttered, his voice cracking. I thought I was saving myself. But I'm just lost. You were right. I've been running from this for too long. Ephraim took a slow, steady breath. The past couldn't be undone, but the future wasn't written yet. You don't have to be that man anymore, he said, his voice firm. You can walk away from this, Osri. But the question is, do you want to? For a long time, Osri didn't speak. He simply stood there, lost in the storm, his weapon still hanging limply in his hand. And in that moment, Ephraim understood. This wasn't a victory, but it was a step forward. Merrin, weakened and helpless, had no fight left in him. His body was now still, the pain of his choices settling into silence. Ephraim glanced at him one last time, the weight of his death pressing down on his heart. The cost of loyalty, the cost of betrayal, had been too high. Ephraim didn't know what would happen next, but one thing was certain. He wasn't running anymore. This was the end of the old Ephraim, and the beginning of something new. As the storm continued to rage, Ephraim turned away, his heart heavy but resolute. The reckoning was over, for now. But the path ahead was clearer than it had ever been. And no matter what came next, he was ready to face it. Your subscription is deeply appreciated. It's a simple click to help us grow and keep creating content that resonates with you. Thank you for being part of this journey. The rain had started to ease, but the tension in the air was far from gone. Ephraim and Osri stood facing each other in the quiet aftermath of the storm. The noise of the rain had been replaced by the distant rumble of thunder, but their shared silence felt deafening. It was as if the world had stopped turning for a moment, leaving them alone with the weight of their shared past. Ephraim knew this moment was inevitable. He had been running from the truth for so long, telling himself that he had been the one wronged, that Osri had betrayed him when he needed him most. But as he stood there, looking into Osri's eyes, he could feel something shifting, a change he hadn't expected. Osri wasn't the man he thought he was. "You're right," Osri said, breaking the silence, his voice low but filled with a strange kind of resignation. "I left you, Ephraim. I left you to take the fall. But it wasn't because I didn't care. It was because I was too afraid to lose everything. I was too afraid of the truth." Ephraim felt a pang of confusion. This wasn't what he had expected. He had always believed that Osri's betrayal was born out of malice, that he had abandoned him without a second thought. But now, as Osri spoke, Ephraim began to see the cracks in the story he had told himself for years. "I never wanted to be the one who betrayed you," Osri continued, his voice filled with a raw emotion Ephraim hadn't heard before. "But I couldn't stand by you when it all came crashing down. I made a choice, and I chose to protect myself. I chose to keep my hands clean while you took the blame." Ephraim stood frozen, trying to process Osri's words. The betrayal had always seemed so simple, so black and white in his mind. Osri had abandoned him, and that was the end of it. But now, the truth felt more complicated, more painful. "I thought I was protecting you," Osri said, his voice thick with regret. "I thought you would have a better chance if you took the fall. I didn't think you'd lose everything. I didn't think it would destroy you the way it did." The realization hit Ephraim like a ton of bricks. Osri hadn't betrayed him out of cruelty. He had done it out of fear. Fear of losing everything, his career, his power, his status. And in doing so, he had sacrificed their bond, their friendship. Ephraim had always believed that Osri was the one who had chosen to walk away, but now he understood. Osri had never walked away because he didn't care. He had walked away because he was too scared to face the consequences of his own actions. For the first time in years, Ephraim felt a strange kind of empathy for Osri. The man who had once been his comrade, his mentor, had been consumed by his own fears and regrets. He had betrayed Ephraim, yes, but in doing so, he had betrayed himself too. "I hated myself for what I did to you," Osri admitted, his voice cracking. "I still do. I couldn't face you, Ephraim. I couldn't face the fact that I had destroyed everything we worked for. I've been running from that truth ever since." Ephraim stood there, stunned by the admission. He had spent years resenting Osri, blaming him for everything that had gone wrong in his life. But now, as he listened to Osri's words, he realized that the betrayal had been more complicated than he had ever allowed himself to believe. It wasn't just Osri who had been destroyed by this, Ephraim had been too. The storm had passed, leaving behind a sense of clarity that Ephraim had never expected. The truth was painful, yes, but it was also liberating. There was no more running from the past. No more hiding from the mistakes they had both made. They couldn't undo what had been done, but they could finally face it. "You're right," Ephraim said quietly, his voice steady despite the weight of everything he had just learned. "We can't undo the past, but we can choose how to live with it. And we can choose to stop running." For the first time in years, Ephraim felt a sense of peace settle over him. The truth about Osri's betrayal wasn't as clean-cut as he had thought, but in that complexity, he found something more important than revenge. He found forgiveness. Ephraim took a deep breath, the weight of his own guilt lifting just a little. "I'm not running anymore, Osri," he said, his eyes meeting the man who had once been his closest friend. "And I'm not letting you run either. The truth's been buried long enough." Osri didn't say anything. Instead, he simply nodded, a small but significant gesture of understanding. In that moment, neither of them was running from the truth anymore. The past was still there, but it no longer had the power to control them. And as the storm continued to subside, Ephraim knew that he had finally found the path forward, not through vengeance, but through understanding. As the storm finally subsided, Ephraim stood quietly, a heavy silence enveloping them both. The world around them had calmed, but within Ephraim's heart, a tempest of emotions swirled. What had begun as a journey for vengeance, a quest to confront the man who had once been his brother, had transformed into something far more profound, a path of redemption, not just for Osri, but for himself as well. Osri stood before him, his shoulders slumped in defeat. The bravado, the hardened exterior that had once made him a force to be reckoned with, had all but dissolved. Ephraim had expected anger, hatred, or perhaps even violence, but what he received was vulnerability, a side of Osri he had long thought buried under layers of fear and pride. "I didn't think it would be like this," Osri admitted softly, his voice tinged with a raw honesty that surprised Ephraim. "I thought I could outrun it all. But I can't anymore. I can't keep pretending I didn't do what I did to you, to us." Ephraim looked at him, not with contempt or resentment, but with a deep understanding. Forgiveness was not just an act of releasing someone from guilt. It was an act of liberating oneself from the chains of anger and bitterness that had bound him for so long. Ephraim knew that the only way forward, the only way to truly find peace, was through forgiveness. "You don't have to run anymore, Osri," Ephraim said, his voice calm, but firm. "You've been running from yourself, from the truth. But now, you've got to face it. I'm not asking you to erase what happened, but I'm asking you to stop living with the weight of it on your back." For a long time, Osri didn't respond. His gaze fell to the ground, his mind clearly wrestling with the weight of what had been said. Ephraim could see the internal battle in his eyes, the urge to deny, to protect himself from the shame and guilt. But slowly, a shift occurred. The walls Osri had built around himself began to crumble. "I don't know how to make it right," Osri finally spoke, his voice rough with emotion. "But I know I can't keep running from this. I don't expect you to forgive me, but I need to stop hiding from it." Ephraim took a slow, deliberate step toward him, a gesture of solidarity, not just for Osri, but for himself. This wasn't about excusing the past, it was about healing from it. "You don't have to make it right," Ephraim said softly, his words carrying a weight far heavier than the storm had. "I don't think either of us can do that. But we can choose to start fresh. Not with the past dragging us down, but with the understanding that we're still here. And that's enough." There was a moment of profound stillness between them, as if time itself had taken a deep breath. The weight of years of bitterness, guilt, and regret seemed to settle in the space around them, but it wasn't suffocating. It wasn't overwhelming. It was released, like air escaping from a long-forgotten chamber. Osri finally looked up at Ephraim, his eyes wet, but no longer filled with anger. Instead, there was something new, something raw, something human. Vulnerability. "I don't know if I can forgive myself," Osri murmured. "But I can start. I can stop running." Ephraim smiled, a quiet but genuine smile, one that was filled with understanding. Forgiveness was not a gift he was giving to Osri. It was a gift he was giving to himself. By letting go of the anger, He was freeing his own soul from the prison it had been trapped in for years. "We don't have to be perfect," Ephraim replied, his voice steady. "We just have to be willing to try." For the first time in a long time, the rain stopped. The clouds parted, and the first rays of sunlight filtered through, bathing them both in a soft, golden glow. The world around them was still, but something had changed. A shift had occurred. As Ephraim turned to leave, he glanced back one last time at Osri, who was standing alone in the aftermath, the storm having passed. And in that brief moment, Ephraim realized something profound. Redemption didn't come from revenge or punishment. It came from understanding, from recognizing the truth, and from choosing to move forward together. "Take care of yourself, Osri," Ephraim said, his voice soft but resolute. "We all deserve a second chance." With that, Ephraim walked away, his heart lighter than it had been in years, knowing that the path of forgiveness, though difficult, was the one that led to peace. As for Osri, he stood in the quiet aftermath, the weight of his past still there but no longer suffocating him. And for the first time in a long time, he allowed himself to breathe. Would you believe it? Forgiveness, the ultimate plot twist. Not quite the thunderous final showdown, but the kind of emotional twist that leaves you thinking, well, who would have guessed the real battle was with themselves? Sometimes, the most challenging confrontation is with the truth. Funny how that works, right? The silence that followed Ephraim's departure was unlike anything Osri had ever experienced. The air felt still, but it was charged, filled with the weight of unspoken truths, past regrets, and the faintest hint of hope. For the first time in years, Osri felt something stirring deep inside, a flicker of something he hadn't felt in a long time, the possibility of change. As Ephraim walked away, leaving Osri to stand in the aftermath of their confrontation, the weight of everything that had happened began to settle in. The storm had passed, but the clarity of the moment remained, and with it, the realization that the world was no longer the same. Osri had been given a chance to change, but the question now was whether he could take it. Osri remained rooted to the spot for a long time, his eyes fixed on the ground, the weight of his decisions pressing down on him. The world around him felt different. The rain had stopped, the storm had cleared, and for the first time, the sun broke through the clouds. Its golden light filtered down, casting a warm glow over the earth as if the universe itself were offering him a second chance. He thought back to the way things had been when he and Ephraim had worked together, before the mistakes, before the betrayal. They had been a team, partners, comrades, fighting side by side. Somewhere along the way, Osri had lost sight of that, focused more on his own survival than the bond they had shared. But now, with the storm behind him, he saw the path forward clearly. It wasn't about power. It wasn't about control. It was about choosing a different life. As the light grew brighter, Osri took a deep breath, exhaling the past he had tried so hard to outrun. He didn't know what the future held, or if he could truly redeem himself. But for the first time, he felt something stir inside him, a desire to be better. To stop hiding from the mistakes that had shaped him and to begin the long, difficult process of rebuilding. Osri turned and began walking away, his steps slow but deliberate. The road ahead was uncertain, but one thing was clear. He had a chance to start over. The future was still unwritten, and he would write it differently this time. Ephraim drove away, the truck rumbling beneath him as the road stretched endlessly ahead. The storm had cleared, but the unsettled feeling inside him remained, gnawing at him like a distant memory he couldn't shake. The weight of his choices, of the confrontation with Osri, still pressed on his chest, but there was something different now. He wasn't running anymore. Kale sat beside him, his head resting against the side of the seat, his eyes alert, scanning the road ahead. Despite the years of pain, despite the battle scars, Ephraim could feel the unspoken connection between them. They had come a long way together, From the days when they had trained as one unit to the darkest moments where Ephraim had felt lost. But now, as they drove forward, there was a quiet sense of resolve, of peace, in Ephraim's heart. He glanced out the window as the sun finally broke through the clouds, casting long, golden rays across the landscape. It was a new day. A beginning. Ephraim knew he couldn't undo the past. He couldn't change the things he had done, or the people he had hurt. But what mattered now was the road ahead. He wasn't alone anymore. Cale was with him, and for the first time in years, Ephraim felt a glimmer of hope, a small but significant spark that he hadn't felt in so long. As they drove further, Ephraim thought back to his time with Osri. The friendship, the betrayal, the years of anger and regret. He didn't know what would become of Osri. The man was lost in his own way, carrying the weight of his own choices. But for Ephraim, the reckoning had come, and he had faced it. He didn't need to wait for anyone else to change. He had done what he needed to do. The road ahead seemed endless, but Ephraim wasn't afraid anymore. He was free. He didn't have all the answers. He didn't know what the future would hold. But for the first time in a long time, he felt a sense of clarity, a sense of peace. And with that, the truck continued down the road, the world unfolding before them, wide and open, waiting to be explored. The past was behind him, but the future was just beginning. Support our team by subscribing, sharing this video with your friends and family, hitting the like button, and commenting your thoughts below. If you're eager for more, let us know if you'd like to hear part 2 of this story.